Maar ik ben er niet van morgen. Ja. I'm just going to introduce you very, very briefly. Good morning. Very inclusive way to say it. I'm very pleased to be invited to chair the first session of day 2. I'm very clear instructions. Like yesterday, you will speak for half an hour or less. If you speak for longer, you simply go to very fast. We will have then 40 minutes, 25 minutes. I will definitely. Then there will be a quarter of an hour Q&A, and then we will move on to the next session. There will be a break. So for now, it's my pleasure to introduce to you the true Dr. Rabbiner. I will essentially very pleased to introduce you that way. Dr. Professor Jacob Adler from the University of Amsterdam, who's working on Spinoza and fundamental medical. And today, we will be talking about the intended audience of monastic Israel's
Thank you very much. Thank you. First of all, it's wonderful to be here, and I want to thank all the organizers and maybe even more of the funders for making it possible for me to be here in Amsterdam, and hopefully not my last. Who was the intended audience of Manasseh ben Israel? This question is more than just theoretical. That was brought home to me by a recent incident. As some of you know, I worked along with Dr. Mark Lippman on an English translation of Chaim, which will be published by Lippman Library, which is, as you know, an academic press. A few weeks ago, I was contacted through Steve by a man named Nachi Weinstein, who is editing a Hebrew edition, which will hopefully be published as a state fair. That is a religious book aimed at people in the Talmudic world, by a publisher that specializes in books of that sort. By the way, just looking for donations to fund that. We discussed some of the challenges. Not you. No. Not anyone feels like it. We discussed some of the challenges of such an edition, in particular, the numerous references to Christian and classical sources. One particular question arose: should the footnotes referring to such sources be sent in Hebrew type or in the Latin alphabet? This minor issue is actually a bit of a dilemma. If set in a Hebrew font, such references can be close to inscrutable. And I personally spent a whole day on and off vainly trying to decipher Manasseh's references. Someone who spelled something Yud Aleph Vav Kuf Vav until a kind correspondent not only identified him for me as Palestino student, but also provided a link to the relevant quotation. On the other hand, Nachi Weinstein pointed out that his intended audience would be put off by a plethora of footnotes in Latin script. The book, after all, is intended to be a sefer. That's what put off his intended audience. I pointed out that the references are there, so his intended readers have to deal with them whenever alphabet is used. I suspected that describing them in Latin letters was a deal breaker, concealing them in Hebrew letters was something better. The book, I thought, would scarcely appeal to people who be exploring. Yet he pointed out that Chaim Elazar Shapira, the Munkacher Rebbe from 1937, warmly recommends this Chaim, calling it a lovely book that is worthwhile, suitable, and proper to study. The question of intended readership is made more pointed by Manasseh's repeated direct appeals to the eager reader or intelligent reader, often in the form, you, enlightened reader, or now enlightened reader. There are about 50 such addresses to the audience. I must confess that an anonymous reviewer for a journal whose name I no longer recall pointed out that such addresses to the reader were not uncommon in Manasseh's time. But the fact is that they are rare in Manasseh's other books, and common in Nishmat Chaim. I must depend on my own rather subjective impression, but there's really nothing else to rely on. But some of these addresses to the reader seem peremptory rather than perfunctory. For example, in book 1, chapter 10, he writes, "And you, perceptive reader, incline thine ear to me and hear my speech." Here, Manasseh is quoting from Psalm 17, which his readership would have been familiar with, A heartfelt, one might say, a desperate appeal to God. The effect seems to be the same as what occurred to me when recently reading Yitzhak Buchbaum's Light and Fire of the Baal Shem Tov. If anyone knows that, it's a collection of the teachings ascribed to the founder of Hasidism. I was under the impression that I was reading a more or less academic text, and my impression was not overturned until I get to page 6 and suddenly read the following words written by Buchbaum. Precious Jews, brothers and sisters, there are those who say that you have finally lost the pious instinct of your holy ancestors. I, Yitzchak, son of Meir and Charna, deny it. The spark of holiness in each Jew will never disappear, God forbid. All at once, the author was talking to me. Similarly, my impression on reading the Shema Chaim is that his readers would have experienced something similar, and with good reason. The goal of the Shema Chaim is to uphold the doctrine of the immortality of the soul, the denial of which shatters the foundations of religion. As it also writes in Book 4, Chapter 4, upon this principle of the immortality of the soul depend, enlightened reader, the prime cornerstones and roots of our faith, namely the existence of God, Torah from heaven, and reward and punishment. And also is appealing to the reader, whoever he or maybe she may be, to save Judaism from imminent destruction. Now, our colleague Sina Rauschenbach points out that the Shema Chaim seems to have for a time attracted more Christian than Jewish readers. And there are some factors that might incline us to think that it was intended, at least in part, for Christian readership. Manasseh was acquainted with many Christian scholars, some of whom had a reasonable commitment of Hebrew. And in the dedicatory epistle written in Latin and placed at the head of the book, Manasseh suggests that it's such an intended readership. This book, he says, and I quote, is equally useful to everyone in the matter of religion, and moreover, is written in the holy tongue, which is now familiar to nearly all learned men and accessible, on account of its evenness of style. The book, and end of quote, the book is also accompanied by a descriptive Latin table of contents. Read the gist of each chapter, reminiscent of many books today that include an English language abstract chapters. This feature in recent books serves as an aid to the Anglophone reader who has some knowledge of Hebrew but not enough to easily find his or her way to the book. Manasseh's Latin table of contents would suggest a similar purpose. There were indeed some Christian Hebraeus to reference the Shema, but it seems that in general it was more fashioned among the Christians to have a copy of it on one's shelf than to actually read it. I may call attention to the preface of a book called Kavod HaAdam, which is a German translation of the first chapter of Nishmat Chaim, edited by NJSK Vartisel and published in 1724. Vartisel writes in the preface, although this book, from which the present work is translated, can be found in the hands of any scholar, in my judgment, the following must be cited with approval regarding the vast majority of those who are devoted to Hebrew literature. And he quotes someone else, and it's arduous and difficult to understand Talmudic literature, though the prize is open to all. And he invites us to consider what someone named Odelius in his book, runs. Those who occupy themselves with rabbinics and judge it to be an easy thing and suitable for everyone's intellect are either egregious liars or should be counted among the Latin words tend to get
not that many slides. What I have to show. I sent it.
Okay. Did you send it to my face?
Yeah. There. That's hiding there. And so how do I do it? How do I move it?
No, just like this.
No, I definitely don't want that. Okay. Just want to know what I have. I'm not speaking all that frequently, but I want to.
Always that.
Yes, exactly.
There are no collaboration with Russia or Syria. So these are strange. Right. See the bars last night. I'm saying, I mean, there's a whole spectrum of things. More focused on the aspect than intellectual.
I think here's going to be.
Sorry, it's coming.
Yeah. Say.
Great question.
We might.
But
It's part of that same problem. There was an article in it was in RCNI.
We got it out, the PowerPoint. Just, downloading somebody else's, PowerPoint and all.
Companies that are lost by territories, you don't boycott. That's exactly what it was about, yeah.
Hoi, dat goed?
Ja, nou, ik krijg eventjes een PowerPoint moeten downloaden. Ik heb er uitgezet omdat ik hier alle dingen aan ben.
Ik heb het al gezet. Je hebt de hele beamer uitgezet.
Ja, ik heb nu alle dingen aan het doen en die.
Dus je kan hem ook niet op.
Oh, oké. Ik denk even.
De livestream deed het de hele tijd niet, hè?
Ik heb het gehoord.
Wel.
So that's
No, I don't think so. I'm all equal to my colleagues who are signing anything they want without looking at the language. We support the students. Well, let's take a close look at exactly what the students are.
because our demonstration is not impacting non-students. Our board says it's not our staff and the students, it's there is a literature that says that to this is a way for the students they understand. You're not and best understand. And I feel
They're responsible for the state. But they don't.
I don't want so
We can do that down. Yeah, that's fine.
This
That's how we had before.
Okay, that sounds good.
Yeah. But the same people in the
Yeah, that'll be fine.
Yeah,
Fine.
so I'll just cut them out now.
Thank you very much.
it's your exam. Oh, you should. So this is really passive, passive aggression to where you connect, you get your I know, here's a spot. Presentation. Why? Because it's a story. So it's not immaturity, it's not irresponsibility. I don't think it's very consistent. Econ. And actually, I think have you been able to solve then
Hold it.
you
Hold on.
want to get coffee. I'm monopolizing that. I apologize.
I'm eager to hear your. You have so many of the letters, do put it in the framework of. And I think that's hardly ignorant.
Well, he said, oh, no, because I took their opinion. Yes.
There were five brothers, and it's a family, so yes.
No, I really don't.
You know, probably more than the text. It's yeah, but it's a very good. It comes up long after his death. Yes. Something that comes out of ancient texts. Because it keeps on working. Quite recently, we saw person that wants somebody else in the darkness, and the darkness is that you keeps working in this.
I think it's very good.
Yeah.
You're going to use the speed.
No, just a little.
I'm not, I don't have the, my glass on the
It's not a lot. Just 3 pictures.
You're next? You're next?
Uh-huh.
So you're just.
I'm trying to collect my thoughts.
Yeah.
I don't know. If you take your students, it's very. I think it's fascinating. I mean, I'm not the type of. I'm not. I don't think it's competition has. It doesn't matter. I mean, the question. He wrote
Ja, je hebt zo'n toekomstwerk neergezet. Dan komen ze met. Nee, maar op een gegeven moment heb je ook veel dingen ook wel echt of geïmpliceerd. En dan is het ook een goed. Waarom moet je dit nog beantwoorden? Ja, en dan moet je graag niet gelijk. In plaats van en hij wil nou ja, het wordt misschien wel niet erg. Dat is wel. Gewoon denk ik heel belangrijk dat het gaat. Wat heeft hij? Nou, ik denk. Dat is ook informatie. Daar kun je wat mee. Kan ik ook van.
You're old school, huh?
There's only 2 slides.
it's just behind. So it's very confusing if you have to look at it. Yeah.
Much worse than ours. Sure, it's on your right. Welcome back after the coffee break. I'm very pleased to be announcing the next speaker and the final speaker of this morning's session. We will listen to Professor Jacob Beck, holds a PhD from the University of Pennsylvania and is now Professor of History at Princeton University with a specialization, obviously, in early modern Jewish history, writing on the other Modena, on such portals as we've already heard yesterday. Also, I think a translator of modern Hebrew literature. But for today, we'll be speaking on the authors of Chadash, Ezekiel da Silva, and wealth, social study, and knowledge. The floor is yours.
One reason I haven't done what I have always been asked to do, which is to write a biography of Cromwell, is that he is not biographical. Thus, G.R. In quoting this passage at the beginning of Thomas Cromwell, A Revolutionary Life, Dermot McCullough paid homage to his teacher, Sir Geoffrey Elton, while also demonstrating that what Elton claimed could not be done could actually be done with insight and rigor. McCullough's Life of Thomas Cromwell showed with vivid clarity how the history of early modern English bureaucracy was simultaneously the history of royal power, all by way of insistent focus on a single man, Thomas Cromwell. Were the rabbis who lived in early modern Amsterdam biographical? Elton's term. My answer to this question today will be a variant of the yes and no, or it depends, or a no but. This morning, I want to speak about a series of problems that confront the student of early modern Amsterdam who is considering the foolish task of writing a biography of a rabbi. I will focus on half a dozen or so questions that have plagued me and continue to plague me as I think about this problem. After laying out these problems in brief, almost telegraphic terms, I turn to a single passage that pertains to several early modern rabbis connected to Amsterdam in the 17th and 18th centuries. To some of you, this passage will be familiar, and I ask for your forbearance in discussing what may be old hat. But before we turn to this passage, I offer you a few scattered thoughts on the problem of rabbinic biography in early modern Amsterdam. One final preparatory remark. I join my colleagues in thanking our hosts and sponsors. This conference has been energizing and edifying, and a wonderful and pleasant reminder of the value of scholarship. The first and most vexing problem that a biographer faces is how to break the hegemony of the subject. Whether the subject appears as a hero, as in Joseph Davis's life of Yom Tov the Meteller, or as a villain, as in Pavel Macheko's life of Jacob Frank, the subject necessarily exercises the dominant position in the story. How does one shatter this totalizing presence? One technique that a historian can use to break the domineering presence of the male emerges from the evidence. Controversy, polemic, and conflict all offer excellent source material for the historian to pierce the armor of the perfect integral hero, or to demonstrate that even the most heinous villain emerges with greater complexity when viewed from multiple angles. A subject's real-life enemies can be a biographer's best friends. In her study of Moses Hafiz, Elisha Karloff used the correspondence of Chaim Sato to offer a different vantage point on her subject. Hajiz emerges as a cranky old man, and Lutzato as an impetuous youth. But both were fighting over nothing less than the nature of prophecy and divine revelation. Lawrence Stone was once quoted as saying, "No one reads past the first chapter of your book." That was the 1970s. These days, it is not clear if anyone reads past the acknowledgments. But let us imagine a single reader old enough to crack the spine, scroll further down and get past the opening chapter. Biographies may be fun to read, but the first chapter is often dreadfully boring. There are a number of ways of overcoming the tedium of origins. But we begin at the end. Who doesn't love a good death scene to open a book? The extraordinary dissertation that Elliot Horowitz wrote on Jewish confraternity in Italy begins with the tale of two funerals, and it remains one of the finest things that he ever wrote. It also remains unpublished. One can begin a book at mid-career, as Abraham Socher did in his treatment of Palestine. My point is a simple one. The problems of beginnings is not as obvious as it might seem to someone writing a biography of a subject from cradle to grave. All historical subjects, whether the biography of an individual, a study of an institution, the history of an event, pose a problem of material and sources. Yet the problem of sources in terms of biography seems especially acute. When writing a biography, one has to be especially cognizant of a basic question. Who's in charge? The material or the historian? Simply because one has found new data on a historical subject does not necessarily make it worthy of comment or even publication. Moreover, when it comes to writing a biography of an early modern rabbi, this problem takes on two added dimensions. One has to do with the quantity of the source material, and a second has to do with the nature of this material. Simply put, as one enters the early modern period, let us say roughly from 1490 to 1789, one faces an increasingly large paper trail. This is not to say that our source material for rabbis in the Middle Ages is so scarce as to be negligible. Indeed, in the case of Maimonides, a range of scholars have shown this to be emphatically not true. And in the case of Rabbeinu Tam, Rami Reiner has shown just how inventive one can be with rabbinic material to reconstruct the life of a Tosaphist who is both central and elusive in medieval Jewish life. But it is to say that from the late 15th century up through and beyond the late 18th century, rabbis begin to leave greater and more varied traces in the historical record. The historian can no longer simply turn to the collected writings of rabbinic figures to reconstruct his life. Rather, the historian can supplement this material with sources extracted from public and private archives, wills, marriage contracts, receipts for payments, letters. The stuff of social history, in the best sense of the term, suddenly can provide us with new data about rabbinic elites. Thus, Andrew Burns recently published the will of Ovadia Sforno he unearthed in the state archives of Bologna, and he established that this biblical commentary was also a member of the banking elite in Bologna. A second dimension has to do with the quality of these materials. Rabbis have been graphomaniacs since as long as there have been rabbis. But beginning in the early modern period, rabbis start to tell stories about themselves. Yom Tov Ben Heller and Jacob Emden all wrote narratives about their own lives. Whether or not we can call these texts autobiographies, for which there is enough evidence to argue for and against the use of this term, or whether one calls them ego documents, a cumbersome term introduced a few decades ago that refuses to go away, a historian who writes about these figures faces a specific challenge. These autobiographies or ego documents often render the subject of an unreliable but very present source about his own life. Some of the autobiographies are so good that they undercut any attempt to write a biography. Thus, Henry Adams' Education has endured as a better book than either Ernest Samuel's two-volume Life or David Brown's recent Black American Aristocrat. Edward Said's Out of Place far outstripped Timothy Brennan's Places of Time. There are many reasons to lack a nuanced and fully rounded understanding of Jacob Emden, but one of them is certainly the overwhelming presence of his own writing about himself. Looking beyond the problems of sources and the historian's relations to these sources, biography as a genre poses a number of pitfalls. Many scholars, myself included, suffer from a neurotic form of completism, the belief that one can reconstruct the past in all of its plenitude. This receives its most perfect literary form in Borges's Funes, and its most perfectly scholarly form in the Annal ideal of a total history, or Histoire Totale, smart. Biography strikes me as another form of completism, or as an ally that one reconstruct an individual's life in all of its purpose. Moreover, as a genre, biography seems almost deceptively easy, almost like a novel translator telling an experience to one that while translating poetry is difficult, prose poses no problem. A historian would be a to think that biography poses a ready-made form, which he or she or they can promptly offer praise or blame for a chosen subject. The first risks hagiography, and the second tendentiousness. Although given the choice, I would much prefer a character assassination. The remainder of
Omdat hij het niet heel goed doet. Dus,
The lights go down, which means the show's about to start. So welcome to the fourth and final session of our conference on rabbis in early modern Amsterdam. And our first speaker this afternoon is Tirza Lely Bernfeld. Tirza is co-author with Bart of the Women Jews in the Netherlands, a short history, and also author of the wonderful book, Poverty and Welfare of Portuguese Jews in Early Modern Amsterdam. And the title of her talk today is Portuguese Women and Spiritual Leadership in Early Modern Amsterdam.
Thank you very much. Thank you for inviting me here. It's a big pleasure. And I will talk about Rabbanim, but from different perspectives. It's work in progress. Rebbetzin or Rabbanit is an age-old phenomenon in the traditional Jewish community, which emerges as a central figure of working behind the scenes to support a partner, building community life and offering comfort to those in need. So far, little is known of the role in the community of early modern Amsterdam, where she was confronted with refugees, former conversos had to be absorbed, integrated, and re-educated. The leadership had to make sure these people adjust and adapt to normative change. The following presentation will try to highlight in this respect the role of the Rabbanit and that of other female members of the religious leadership. Moreover, the question will be posed: to what extent rabbis were involved in topics dealing with women and family life. It is well known and described in true length that the 5 women in the Portuguese community of Amsterdam definitely played a role in life, remained largely in the background due to the Spanish Arab culture they were raised in, reinforced by the traditional Jewish view on women placed at a lower level in the hierarchy. We can find traces of these principles in writings, like that of Prado. This one is Hazan of the Spanish Portuguese community of emphasizes superiority of men over women. He continued, or rather summarized in this respect the work written by the Amsterdam rabbi already 40 years earlier. As Menashe in his last part of the Jozor, the women of the Spanish nation, he also implied them to be below men, ordering them to be obedient and behave humbly. Such attitude towards women prevalent among the Portuguese in the Dutch Republic explains why it's so difficult to hear voices of Portuguese women in general and those of women related to the spiritual leadership in particular. Women face unique challenges as they set foot on Dutch soil. Besides arriving as part of a nuclear family, they often had broken units or came as individuals, mostly fleeing persecutions on the Peninsula. Others were married to their old or new Christian husbands, if they were, often had no intention to follow them to the Jewish world. There were those who had no clue of their partner's whereabouts. It is this whole contingent who had to be introduced in the laws of normative Jewish life, just like their male counterparts. The difference was that no formal education was offered to women until the latter part of the 18th century. An alternative source of information consisted of handbooks, as the ones I just mentioned, explaining the different components of Judaism, including those related to married life and kashrut. Women could also have collected information orally through their husbands, through their sons, through their Ashkenazi servants, or through their religious leadership, including their partners. These wives of the religious leadership often didn't have an easy life. The future bride of Chacham Shaul Levi Mortera, for example, was only to return to normative Judaism in Amsterdam after she won the first dowry through the Amsterdam-based International Dowry Society in 1650, having resided with her mother as an orphan in France before. Chacham Isaac Abu da Fonseca and Rav Moshe Raphael Dagda took their families from the protected atmosphere of Amsterdam to an unknown and often hostile world in Brazil. Some of their children were born there. Chacham Shlomo Salem, a century later, had his wife come over from the Eastern Sephardi diaspora. Her first impression of the new environment she was confronted with must have been strange or even insulting, as she was ordered to change her clothing style that would be more appropriate to the new setting, although not as modern as shown here. Despite the obstacles these women were confronted with, it's safe to say that with the foundation of the Amsterdam Portuguese community and the arrival and training of Rabbanim, also a female religious elite came into being as a trustworthy body, occupying a separate top place in the female hierarchy. This elite was charged with the traditional, practical, and necessary tasks taken up by women, like the preparation of kosher food. Some exploited the ritual bath for women, and others acted as midwives and were charged to make shrouds. There were women who got the privilege to print ktubot. Others seem to have assisted their husbands with the publication of books. As these women kept to these jobs from one generation to another, rabbinical names keep on popping up among them. Elios Abarca Fonseca, Judah Leon, Musafia d'Aguilar, etc. There were more activities taken up by the religious leadership, for example, those related to education. In fact, converters were famous for their role on the Iberian Peninsula, transferring Jewish tradition from one generation to another. Yet there might still have been a lack of knowledge, as the National Display suggests, and a need to introduce them to the different laws of normative Judaism regarding women, married life, and kashrut. In his Zorn Menashe also stresses the importance of education, as he instructs married women to teach their children, as underscored by rabbinic sources. We know the wife of Chassid's spoke being involved in the education of the daughter, and this seems to have been a widespread phenomenon as well. Subjects could have been similar to those instructed to the girls orphanage Mazuna of the girls there, and that those were reading, knitting, and quote unquote instruction into the fear of God. Other often mothers professions such as these were usually. Overall, we could imply that women of the religious elite contributed their part in the education at home and in wider circles. We meet them also in other communal activities. The fact that some of these ladies were allowed to print to what might point at them being involved in introducing brides into married life. Esther Aboua, wife of the Chacham, was registered as a member of the Abi Yotomim Boys Orphanage in 1664. We see her, the registration and her name there. In this orphanage, where she might have helped sewing clothes, taking care of little boys, while receiving Jewish passers-by, as was one of the other goals of that organization. Achesas Tochtas, as a widow, followed in her footsteps. Some became members of the Salim Society, like the wife of Shlomo d'Olivet, or Sarah's second wife, Aboua da Fonseca. They certainly assisted in taking care of the sick and dying women and prepared them for burial, were the task of the burial society. The same Sarah was one of the women who contributed to the Nedavar, collecting money for the building of a new synagogue in 1670, and thus, as the second wife of Chacham, expressed her commitment to the initiative of her husband and to the community and its future. Women Women from the religious elite being members of Dotar, which I just mentioned, were few. I found 2 of them. It doesn't apply to Dotar only, even though many more charitable organizations were set up dedicated to help alleviate the plight of Portuguese women. No female initiatives were found in this respect, including those set into motion by rabbinical families. Ashkenazi women in Amsterdam and elsewhere were more proactive, to use a modern term in this respect. Despite the involvement of the female religious elite in some aspects of communal life, a patriarchal hierarchy was a big element in the Amsterdam Portuguese community, customary or a traditional Kinderab, the highest authority being allocated to the spiritual leadership consisting of women. With their authority and knowledge of Jewish law, from which women were exempt, it was up to them to decide about essential issues, some of them relating to women.
Is this your the interview?
Yeah. Just online, so I'm posting it.
Oh, you're posting it.
Yeah. Yeah, I'll
Oh, you're in charge.
no, no. Yeah, shall I put it on?
If you're busy. Send it to Marguerite. So, yeah, last but not least, there we go. Cool.
Voilà.
Beautiful.
Yes.
And I can just do it. Great.
Yeah, here.
All right, thanks, Doc.
We also have a fancy, nobody uses it.
No. That's too much technology.
I think the I know people who were there, they said it was very, yeah.
Having the right view, like if it's not a massage session, they're saying like, concentration and no, as long as you have to say like, this is what we expect you to do. And this is like,
I don't know. I mean, it's so beyond me. Yeah, I just found gay and So do you know, you're not not so In our countries, yeah, because he's really, he's up to here, right? And he's also spending
Als laatste lezing.
but not least.
Hey, no. Our speaker, once of the great state of Kentucky, now at always of the great state of Kentucky, now at University of Amsterdam. Jessica Vance Reutemann is the author of numerous articles on Jews in the Americas and the Atlantic world. And the title of her talk today is Caribbean Connections and Continuities.
So I'm glad some people came back after our short break.
Yeah, sorry.
No, it's probably a good thing. And I know everyone wants to get to the plural, so I'll try to keep this relatively short. But again, thanks to Steve for conceptualizing the conference, and Bart, David, and particularly Margreet of the Manasseh Ben Israel Institute for making the event happen. It hasn't happened yet, we're almost at the end. I planned to talk about specific rabbis, and I will talk about rabbis, don't worry, because that's the point of our conference, as you know. However, when I was thinking about it, instead of a close study, as I originally conceptualized it, of a specific rabbi or rabbis in the Caribbean, I decided that it would be a little more useful, especially in light of the topic of our conference today, but also our conversations over the last day and a half, to instead think about the rabbinic system, if we can call it that, rabbinic authority in Amsterdam that we've been discussing, and how that same authority or system was negotiated in the colonies. Because indeed, I'm taking you out of Amsterdam finally, we've been focusing there, but we're going to the colonies. We're bringing some sun in. And I'm going to focus mainly on Curacao, though I'll bring in some other colonies and other colonial spaces too. And these pictures you can see are of the Mikveh Israel, now Mikveh Israel Emmanuel Synagogue. It is one of the most important Jewish landmarks in the Americas. It's a beautiful example of Dutch architecture, colonial architecture. It was built in 1732, but actually the synagogue pictured here, the one built in 1732, was the sixth synagogue built in Willemstad, which is the capital of Curacao, and really the only sizable urban space on the island. And it served as and serves to this day as the center for the Jewish community there. So this is the courtyard of said synagogue. And the synagogue, which was the new one in 1732, was actually a whole ritual complex. It included a rabbi's house, a mikveh, a school space, as well as the synagogue proper, which you saw in the other picture with the typical Sephardic sand floors, or sand on the floors. And these buildings and these spaces were all grouped inside the synagogue courtyard. Historian Laura Liebman argues that by building a synagogue complex around the rabbi's house, members of the Mikveh Israel Muhammad attempted to place the rabbi at the center of Jewish life and to clarify the relationship between the synagogues and the rabbis in a place where rabbinical authority was always somewhat tenuous. Although, as we've heard throughout this conference, that wasn't particularly unique, I think, to these colonial spaces either. Prior to 1825, Curacao hosted the largest, wealthiest, and best educated Jewish community in the Americas, rivaled only by Suriname, as you can see. But you also have the often forgotten Dutch islands of Saba, St. Martin, and St. Eustatius. And in the course of the 17th and the 18th centuries, and I'm mostly talking really about the 18th century, there were 8 rabbis that officiated or semi-officiated in Curacao. And with the exception of one of them, all arrived and had been trained in Amsterdam, or had received their training in Amsterdam, where they held posts as teachers or dayanim. The one exception was the much written about Isaac Cargill. He was originally from Hebron, and he happened to arrive. He traveled actually all over the Americas, Jamaica, Barbados, Suriname. He happened to arrive, rather fortuitously for him, 2 months before the sudden death of Isaac Henriquez Faro, and got to take his place for a couple of years. He got to take his place until Jacob de Fonseca returned. He was the only Curaçaoan-born rabbi. He had been sent by the community to Amsterdam to train in Etz Haim, and returned in 1764 and assumed the post of rabbi for actually quite a long time in Curacao. And actually, you may, by the fact that there were 8 rabbis in the 17th and 18th century, you can see that there were some rabbis that held onto the post for a really long time. They lived a long time. Da Fonseca was one of them. So now that this overview is a bit out of the way, although initially Amsterdam and then a bit later London served as the liturgical or religious centers for American Jewry, by the 18th century, mid-18th century, you can kind of pick and choose a date, Jews in the Americas increasingly turned to Curacao, to the Curaçaoan Jewish community, for financial support and, as I'll argue, for religious authority. As this authority, and we can define authority in different ways, emanating from Amsterdam, what had frequently been referred to as the mother community, waned. And I should say that the religiosity, and I think that's also a bit of a difficult word, of Sephardic Jews in the early Americas has generally been overlooked by a lot of historians, and I'll admit that I've been very guilty of this myself. In fact, it was only when I received this wonderful invitation to speak at this conference that I began to think of rabbis and really.
Wel gedaan.
Ja,